The values of the West economic wars: unproductive, destructive, mostly illegal. The imposition of sanctions by the US and the EU, or by whatever state, is legally more than questionable because it should be reserved for the UN Security Council. Here is a session from 2017. Photo, Cancillería Argentina license, CC by 2.0, more info.
The word sanctions is familiar to the public these days. Time and again, radio, television, and the press report on the extension or tightening of sanctions. They are directed against Russia, Iran, or another country. Less familiar is the term economic warfare, which signals more of a threat. But the ideas we associate with it are also far removed from reality and mean trivialization.
By GEORG AUERNHEIMER, note 27.4, 2023.
In 1990, the UN Security Council imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq following Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Apart from the import ban, the lack of foreign currency created an extreme emergency. Because oil exports ceased, food, medicine, and other goods for daily use could not be imported, nor could technical equipment such as water pumps. The economy collapsed. According to Richard Garfield of Columbia University, this led to an exorbitant increase in child mortality between 1991 and 2002. According to his estimate, up to 530,000 children died. According to him, a historically almost unprecedented increase in child mortality. 1. In a 2006 study, Tim Dyson, professor of population sciences at the London School of Economics, estimates the number of dead children under the age of 5 as high as 880,000. How many Iraqis of other ages perished is not known. What is certain is that significantly more mothers died in childbirth. In any case, the sanctions regime, described by U.S. legal and moral philosopher Joy Gordon as an invisible war, had a devastating effect on the health, education, and well-being of almost the entire population. 2. According to Yaak Pabst, political scientist and journalist, this 13-year economic war claimed more human lives than the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 3. Under the impression of the studies on this war, the journalist Michael Holmes wrote in 2010, "Many see sanctions as a moderate means that should be used when diplomacy has failed, but war must be prevented." This view is dangerous. We can learn from the recent history of Iraq that an economic blockade can have just as devastating consequences for a country's civilian population as a military intervention. 4. Carol Tahan, a nun and director of the Italian hospital in Damascus, even said in November 2022 that the sanctions imposed on Syria hit the country even harder than the previous war. As terrible as the time of the war was then, today, Tahan says in a report by Bernd Duschner, who initiated an aid campaign for the hospital, the Syrian population would suffer incomparably more. 5.
Economic war. What is it?
Economic wars have existed since states competed as economic units for sources of raw materials and sales markets. That is to say, since the capitalist mode of production became established. In economic wars, attempts are made, on the one hand, to cut off competing or opposing states from the supply of raw materials and energy sources, and possibly also to impede technological development by banning the import of certain technical components. On the other hand, export bans are intended to curb productivity and reduce foreign exchange earnings, which in turn hinders the purchase of raw materials, energy, and technology. Only the economically stronger states are in a position to take such measures. German peace researchers confirm in a paper that sanctions are an instrument that depends on asymmetry between sanctioner and target. 6. Since the end of the Second World War, the USA has held the record for the most sanctions worldwide, with 42% of all sanctions, followed by the EU with 12%. 7. The USA is thus virtually the world champion in sanctioning. They are also responsible for the historically longest embargo against a country. Since 1960, Cuba has suffered from varying, more or less comprehensive trade restrictions. The fact that the UN General Assembly has already condemned the embargo umpteen times with an overwhelming majority leaves the U.S. administration cold. Due to their unbroken control of the international financial markets and their dominance in the regulatory bodies of the world economy, IMF and World Bank, they have unique opportunities to do so. Recently, for example, they were able to get insurance companies to withdraw insurance cover for the transport of Russian export goods. In 2022, the Western Alliance was able to largely exclude Russian banks from international payments, or at least restrict transactions, by excluding banks from the standardized messaging for financial transactions that SWIFT ensures, even though the Russian Federation had a representative on SWIFT's supervisory board. 8. The Russian economy was thus to be cut off from the global financial system and thus isolated. 10 years earlier, Iranian financial institutions had already been excluded from the payment system in the dispute over Iran's nuclear program. As a result, the country's oil exports halved and its overall foreign trade fell by 30%. In a purely economic war, the aim is the economic ruin of a country, as with the embargo against Cuba, or the economic weakening of an economic competitor, as in the case of the USA against China. In their book on economic warfare, the authors Ehrman and Wolff also include military operations with economic policy objectives and economic sanctions in support of military operations under the term economic warfare. 9. The sanctions imposed by the Western Alliance against the Russian Federation from 2014 onwards to weaken the RF and strengthen Ukraine's defenses would also correspond to this broader term. More historically specific is a narrow notion of economic warfare, which in and of itself is about isolating and weakening a country's economy. Otherwise, British privateering in the 17th century, or even the starvation of a besieged city in the Middle Ages, would also fall under the term. Today's economic wars are total, not to say totalitarian, as they are usually linked to the demonstration of military strength, constructs of the enemy, threat narratives, ideological clashes, and cyber warfare. Harold Kujat, retired general, said in January 2023, "The Ukraine war is not only a military conflict, it is also an economic and an information war." 10.
Are economic wars legal or at least legitimate?
If one applies the international law of war to economic wars, then it becomes clear how legally questionable, even criminal, they are. Acts of war are only permissible within the limits set by the Hague Conventions, especially the Hague Regulations on Land Warfare 1907. The agreements made there under international law serve, among other things, to protect civilians. In 1949, the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war reaffirmed this normatively. An additional protocol of 1977 prohibits attacks on the civilian population in the countryside, terrorist attacks and area bombardments, but also reprisals. Article 52 stipulates, 1. The starvation of civilians as a means of warfare is prohibited para. 2. Sentence 1. 11. Furthermore, it is forbidden to render facilities for the production of food unusable. These provisions can be applied mutatis mutandis to economic warfare. Ehrman and Wolff, who tend to be generous in their interpretation of the law, consider them questionable, at least according to ethical standards, because of the inevitable violation of the immunity of civilians. 12 economic sanctions inevitably almost always affect the civilian population. And as a rule, one wants to do so in order to destabilize a political regime, in the expectation that the hardship will lead to unrest or to the respective government being voted out of office. 13. The fact that this goal is missed according to all previous experience is another matter. Given the interdependence of today's global economy, it is not only the civilian population of the respective country that is endangered by sanctions. The global consequences are difficult to contain. 14. At least in the case of a country rich in raw materials such as the Russian Federation, the collateral damage to large parts of the world's population is incalculable. For example, sanctions against Russia have exacerbated food insecurity in poorer states for several reasons. First, Russia was temporarily unable to export wheat. Secondly, there was the shortage of fertilizer. This was partly due to the increase in the price of natural gas, which is needed for the production of nitrogen fertilizer, which caused production to be curtailed. In addition, the supply of phosphate and potash was reduced. In the past, Russia had covered about 10% of the phosphate demand on the world market. The Food and Agriculture Organization feared tangible crop declines in countries of the Global South in early 2023.15. According to Yaak Pabst, the sanctions against the RF have dramatic effects on poor and wage earners worldwide. 16. In general, full-scale economic wars destabilize the global economy. For the U.S. historian Nicholas Mulder, they have become a major source of international instability. 17. In the Peace Report 2022, scholars state, although many economic sectors of sanctioned states remain open, the risks and legal uncertainties are often too great from the point of view of Western companies and banks, so that even unobjectionable business deals are terminated. 18. The freezing of foreign exchange reserves and exclusion from the international payment system have even greater consequences. According to author Joachim Gilliard, if foreign exchange reserves can be frozen and banks excluded from the interbank system, as has now happened in the case of Russia and previously for Venezuela, Iran, and Afghanistan, no country can feel safe anymore. 19. The UN General Assembly has therefore expressed in several resolutions that coercive economic measures violate or may violate the prohibition of intervention enshrined in customary international law. 20 self-authorized measures not authorized by UN bodies constitute, according to a 2013 UN resolution, a flagrant violation of the principles of international law as well as the principles of the multilateral trading system. The imposition of sanctions by the US and the EU, or by whatever state, is legally more than questionable because it should be reserved for the UN Security Council. What punitive measures the Security Council can decide to impose is mainly regulated in Articles 41 and 42 of the UN Charter. It can prescribe the total or partial interruption of economic relations, of all transport and telecommunications links, and the severance of diplomatic relations. 21 sanctions aimed at regime change, like many U.S. sanctions, violate the prohibition of intervention under international law. In their publication on economic warfare, Ehrman and Wolff at least say that they may violate it. 22. The authors are clearly concerned not to expose the West's policy. Ehrman and Wolff are certain that sanctions designed to make a state respect human rights are permissible. This is highly problematic. For, as is usual within the Western Alliance, this ignores the fact that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes two categories of human rights, namely political and social rights. And these are weighted differently within the world community. Cuba, for example, has a high standard of social rights, including an excellent education and health system. The USA justifies its embargo with the alleged disregard for political rights or civil liberties. Thus, the paradox arises that the United States, with its anti-social education and healthcare system, its hire and fire, deficient labor laws, high poverty and homelessness rates, sanctions Cuba for human rights violations.
Economic wars for the restoration of justice and regime change?
The UN General Assembly has particularly condemned coercive economic measures against developing countries. In 1991, it called on the UN Secretary-General to stop the use of unilateral coercive economic measures against developing countries by some industrialized countries. But more than half of the EU and also UN sanctions between 1991 and 2022 were directed against smaller countries on the African continent and in the Middle East. 23. In April 2023, the sanctions list of the Federal Office of Economics and Export Control included 12 African countries and 8 states that can be categorized as developing countries. In many cases, this is an embargo on military goods or militarily relevant goods, so-called dual-use goods, with the aim of restricting armed conflicts between rival groups. This may often be a legitimate intention. But in the case of these countries in particular, even the sanctions practice of the United Nations generally holds true. Sanctions are still imposed without a thorough analysis of their likely effects. 24. The problem can be illustrated by the example of Burundi. In 2015, the president there sought a third term in office in breach of the Constitution and against widespread protest. He had mass protests put down. Thousands died, others were abducted or imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands fled. Nevertheless, the sanctions seem worthy of discussion if one takes into account that Burundi is one of the poorest countries in the world. News from 2017 was alarming because the lack of foreign currency, a consequence of the EU sanctions at the time, further exacerbated the hardship. 25. The president sat out the economic restrictions. He passed away in 2020. The situation in Afghanistan has been similarly tricky since the Taliban took power in August 2021. There is no doubt that under their rule not only political but also social human rights are being disregarded. 26. But the country is also suffering from an extreme economic crisis, was threatened with economic collapse. It not only has the regime of a corrupt elite and 40 years of war behind it, but also several years of droughts. The humanitarian situation was already catastrophic. And now international sanctions have exacerbated the situation to the point where 97% of the human beings, virtually all Afghans, live below the poverty line. In January 2022, Emran Feroz stated on Deutschlandfunk Radio, after the NATO withdrawal, the country was overrun with economic sanctions, first and foremost on the part of the USA. The reason, they are not satisfied with the new rulers and the disgraceful outcome of the war. Apart from the billions of dollars in aid that have been stopped, Washington has also had the Afghan state reserves abroad frozen to the tune of around $9 billion US. 27. The shortage of money is also affecting humanitarian aid through humanitarian organizations. According to Action gegen den Hunger, 24 million of the total of 40 million Afghans are dependent on humanitarian aid. Many cannot feed themselves sufficiently and are threatened by famine. This includes almost all households headed by women. 28. In consideration of the catastrophic situation, the World Bank reversed the cancellation of funding for some livelihood and health projects in 2022. Syria is a country that until 2011 could be considered more in the group of emerging economies, before it was bankrupted in a civil war in which several externally supported groups, including terrorist organizations such as the Islamic State, fought each other. In addition to the division of the country, among other things, the government has no access to the fertile soils and oil fields in the northeast. The sanctions are preventing an economic recovery. The U.S. and EU are invoking UN Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015, which calls for negotiations between the government and opposition aimed at constitutional reform, which are not progressing. However, according to author Karen Leukefeld, the punitive economic measures of the USA and EU are not approved by the UN Security Council or the General Assembly. 29. According to the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, more than 15 million of around 22 million Syrians, or 77% of households, are unable to secure their basic needs and require livelihood assistance. The head of a hospital already quoted complains that there is no electricity, no gas for cooking, no fuel for heating, no water, not enough food. Electricity is only available for 2 to 3 hours a day, even in the capital. Their hospital has to make do with generators and buy diesel on the black market at horrendous prices. This money is not enough to buy equipment, medicines, and to pay the staff adequately. There is running water only every third day and only for 2 to 3 hours. The UN Special Rapporteur on the consequences of unilateral punitive economic measures called for the lifting of sanctions in November 2022, concluding that they were blocking the reconstruction and stabilization of the country and violating human rights. But even after the devastating earthquake of February 2023, sanctions were only reluctantly eased. The exemptions are insufficient, and contrary to a UN Security Council resolution, the supply of relief goods does not cross front lines. Most of the aid is going to the Idlib region, which is occupied by Turkey and administered by Islamists. The USA and EU want to prevent political stabilization. Their goal is still regime change. This is also the goal of the US and EU sanctions against Venezuela. According to estimates by the Center for Economic and Policy Research (CPR), these sanctions already claimed around 40,000 human lives in 2017, 18.30. At the end of February 2023, U.S. President Joe Biden extended Executive Order 13692, which Barack Obama had issued in 2015. Since then, more than 900 coercive measures have been imposed on Venezuela, including various financial and trade sanctions that prohibit business with state-owned Venezuelan companies, including the state oil company. Biden told Congress in justification that Venezuela continues to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security and foreign policy of the United States. 31.
The economic war against the Russian Federation.
On the 6th of March 2014, the USA and the EU imposed the first sanctions against Russia in view of the planned referendum on the assignment of Crimea. That is to say, without waiting for the referendum and wanting to review the political processes. That it could be a secession was ruled out, although the previous history makes that seem credible. The sanctions hit persons and companies with contact restrictions and the freezing of assets. After the invasion, the EU, in coordination with the G7 countries, adopted the first 3 of 10 sanctions packages to date in just 5 days between the 23rd and the 28th of February, 2022. The measures cover a broad spectrum from individual sanctions to sectoral economic restrictions. 32 financial sanctions form an important component, in particular the aforementioned exclusion from the international payment system SWIFT. Already with the first sanctions package, 7 Russian banks were excluded from SWIFT. In addition, the G7 states set a limit of $300 billion on the RF's foreign reserves. The authors Grauvogel and von Soest speak of an unprecedented act. The declared aim of the sanctions addressed to the RF is the immediate cessation of military action. The economic weakening of the RF is to bring about such a military weakening that the cessation of attacks and, if favorable, capitulation will be forced. The intention is to limit the RF's ability to finance the war and to wage it at the cutting edge of technology. 33. The latter is to be achieved by import bans on dual-use goods of a high-tech standard. To the disappointment of the Western Alliance, the economic war against the RF has not produced the desired effects by spring 2023. Grauvogel and von Soest try to gloss over this somewhat, but have to admit, the Russia sanctions make clear the possibilities and limits of this means of foreign policy. 34. They explain the moderate effectiveness with the fact that authoritarian governments, despite the coercive measures, are often firmly in the saddle. What they do not want to admit is the relative isolation of the Western Alliance within the much-vaunted international community. It is true that the UN General Assembly condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine by a large majority in a resolution on the 2nd of March 2022, 141 votes in favor, 5 against, 35 abstentions. And roughly the same approval was given in October 2022 to a resolution calling for the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity. 35. But the sanctions policy is partly undermined and openly disregarded, especially by the countries of the Global South, or explicitly rejected, as for example by South Africa. The usual economic indicators, GDP, inflation rate, are still in the green zone for the RF. Experts expect a recovery from previous dampeners of growth in 2023.36. The West must even fear that the compulsion to import substitution will strengthen Russia's autarky. If more has to be produced in the country itself, dependence on energy exports, extra activism would be overcome. The economy's resilience owes much to cooperation with the PRC, which is gradually being deepened. Sanctions have been used to promote Russia's rapprochement with China, an undesirable side effect that experts are loath to admit. The PRC's openness to cooperation with the RF is understandable since the collective West has been fighting China as an economic rival. China, which has risen to become a high-tech country, in alliance with Russia, which is rich in raw materials, will result in an even stronger rival.
Sanctions, soon a strategy of yesterday?
Possibly the West is learning from its experience. The desired destabilization of the RF has not been achieved so far. The goal of regime change in Syria and Venezuela has so far been missed. It is more than unlikely that the economic sanctions will shake the Taliban regime. This is also hardly to be expected in the case of Iran. With its sanctions policy, the West is only earning the displeasure of the rest of the world, and in some cases even the support of China and Russia. For in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, people are fed up with this policy, judging by various statements and diplomatic offensives. Either the human beings themselves have experienced sanctions or have seen what sanctions do to a country. With colonialism still in their memory and the debt bondage of the IMF and the World Bank before their eyes, they do not also want to endure sanctions and the consequences of sanctions. But it may be that a world power in decline is unteachable. Then the USA and the EU in its wake will also wage economic wars in the future. In any case, they will continue to resort to economic policy measures in the fight against the rising economic power China.
The author GEORG AUERNHEIMER, born 1939, held a professorship in educational science at the University of Marburg from 1972 to 1995, and at the University of Cologne from 1995 until his retirement in 2005, where he co-founded the Research Center for Intercultural Studies. After 2005, he lectured for several years in the Global Studies program at the University of Salzburg. This was associated with his turn to political science topics and political journalism. He has published books on globalization 2015, 2019, on the causes of flight 2018, identity politics 2020, and privatization 2021.